Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on the history of India between 750 CE and 1206 CE. Today, we will be talking about South Indian urban processes. Now, urbanization in South India happened in two phases: the early historical period and the early medieval period. In the early historical period, urbanization started to develop after the 3rd century BCE. The earliest towns rose in the fertile agricultural tracts of the major river valleys, also known as the Marutam Tinai, as well as the coastal areas called the Nitals. These were also the centers of political power and the capitals of dynasties. So the Cheras rose in the Periyar Valley, the Cholas in the Kaveri Valley, and the Pandyas in the Vaigai and Tamraparni valleys. So we see two major types of urban centers at this point: the Marutam, which was an inland town of political and commercial importance, and the Nital, a coastal town, which was a center of trade and commerce. Thus the Cholas had Urayur and Kaveripumpattinam. The Pandyas had Madurai and Korkai, and the Cheras had Vanchi and Muchiri. This pattern of urbanization created dual centers of power. Historical research has shown that extensive urbanization that happened in South India in the early historical phase was heavily influenced by external trade. And there are even claims that a decline in trade after the 3rd century CE caused a crisis. Now, from the early historical, let us move to the early medieval period. Urbanization happened over a span of 6 centuries, from the 7th to the 13th centuries. This was not a sudden or abrupt event, but the culmination of multiple processes. From the 5th century onwards, there was extension of agricultural activities in the river valleys targeted towards a more intensive and efficient organization of production that would increase yield and enable agriculture to support larger population in the temple centers and in the Brahmadaya villages. These settlements would emerge as the main focus of urban growth in the 9th century. In the Pallav Pandya period, seats of royal power like Kanchipuram and Madurai experienced further growth. In the early medieval period, this growth took the form of greater integration with their hinterland areas as well as their ports on the coast. Part of this process was the simultaneous development of a number of Brahmadayas, which had temples in their center surrounded by agricultural and pastoral settlements. Apart from these centers, the other major category of urban settlement at this time was the commercial market center, the Nagaram. The Nagarams linked the royal centers with the rural hinterlands of the Kaveri Valley and the coast. They were located at nodal areas such as river confluences and the delta. Thus, the elements for large-scale urbanization were already taking shape in early medieval South India. Now, we must take a very brief look at the historiography surrounding this issue. To best understand this complex and multifaceted history, we need to refer to stellar work done by the eminent historian Champakalakshmi. Detailed analysis of South Indian historical urban processes. He has commented that while urban centers are often described in historical works, there is a lack of coherent conceptual framework to understand the nature and development of urban processes. Thus, these works fail to understand the link between agriculture and urbanization and therefore miss the complexity of the processes that made historical urbanization possible. Champakalakshmi goes on to point out that historian Bertenstein's model of the segmentary state in South India does not explain the nature of urban processes properly. Champakalakshmi saw the Nagaram as primarily a merchant organization and remarked that urbanization and temples were related. This was a highly incomplete analysis. Champakalakshmi also criticizes Kenneth Hall's research on the Nagaram, pointing out how he had mischaracterized organizations like the Periya Nadu, which was actually a guild for dealers in agricultural commodities, and not really a body for social integration, as has been argued by Hall. So, having sorted out these issues, we come to early medieval urban development. As has been stated previously, the early historical period saw a close link between trade and commerce on the one hand and urbanization on the other. However, in the early medieval period, an extremely important factor was the close link between agricultural development and urbanization. In fact, there was a strong rural-urban continuum and linkages, which has led historians to inquire about the specific nature of these linkages, as well as the linkage between large-scale trade, agriculture, and urbanization. In early medieval South India, during the Pallav Pandya period, agricultural extension and organization took the form of land grants to Brahmins in the form of Brahmadeyas and Devdans. This was a major shift in agricultural organization and stimulated intensive agricultural production. Subsequently, trade centers began to develop based on this new agricultural development. With the increase in trade and commerce, there was a development of merchant guilds and specialization in marketing of goods through the Nagaram, including exotic and luxury goods. This activity was promoted by royal initiatives like conquests, building ports, and encouragement of production and guild activity. The next step in this process was the specialization of crafts and the growth of craft production centers that could take advantage of the trade network to market their goods to expanding internal and external markets. This marked a shift from agricultural to non-agricultural economic activities. Thus, in this period, urbanization was a lengthy process which started off with a strong agricultural basis but eventually shifted to emphasize crafts and trade. The Chola period saw a different pattern. Firstly, existing rural settlements started to expand and then form into clusters, which eventually would become the nucleus of kingdoms. Secondly, the temple centers operated as engines of urban growth. They were already important sacred pilgrimage centers, and they soon gained political and administrative importance. At this stage, huge urban complexes began to develop either around one massive temple or around multiple temples which had expanded to form a temple complex. These temples, which were often built by rulers as means of legitimization of their rule, soon became major landowners, ruling over thousands of tenants. Whatever gold or other endowments they received were reinvested into land or trade. Naturally, these economic activities led to further urban development. These temple centers operated on multiple dimensions. On one level, they were the centers for the manifestation of the rural urban continuum, being the places where the agricultural goods and local commodities were exchanged. On another level, they were also the centers of long distance trade, where luxury and exotic items from foreign lands were brought to market. Both these aspects of exchange played important roles in urban development. The demand generated by the emerging elite class and these markets attracted large numbers of craftsmen and artisans who settled in these towns and joined the urban crowd. Of course, this was a slow and gradual process. For initial conditions of urban development, it is important to look at the first trend, that is, clustering rural settlements, specifically Brahmadeyas and Devadanas, merging into cities. A good example of such a city is Kudamukku Palayarai, that is the residential capital of the Cholas. This city grew up in the rich and fertile Kaveri River delta. Once the rural settlements had merged into large towns, temples developed in the twin settlements of Kudamukku and Palayarai. The temples soon expanded with their own treasuries and administrative machinery that was controlled by the landowning groups like the Brahmins and other high castes. With the rise of Chola power, different classes of royal servants, like the members of the royal family, palace servants, leading officers, major landowners, and merchants, all became involved in the temple administration. Apart from this administrative and landowning class, architects, sculptors, metal workers, and textile workers had also settled here in large numbers. This sustained agrarian expansion laid the basis for large-scale commercial development after the 9th century. There had been some commercial development in Pallava times. For example, Kachi was a major commercial and textile production center. And under the Cholas, it would continue to grow into an even more prestigious market and eventually develop into Kanchipuram. It even gained political importance and became a secondary political center. It has retained its commercial importance to the present day. Such settlements often owed their original growth to royal patronage. Another such Pallava example is the port of Mamallapuram, which was a center of large network of maritime commerce. Even though it would be superseded by Nagapattinam as the chief port under the Cholas, it would continue to be a very important center of coastal trade. Now, we must take a look at the role of the Nagarams in Chola history. we see an acceleration in the pace of the development of the nagarams under the Cholas in proportion to the pace of commercial development. Historian Hall has seen them as district marketing centers with one nagaram per nadu, with the nadu being the marketing hinterland for the nagaram. However, here, historian Champaka Lakshmi has pointed out that there were often nadus with more than one nagarams. The nagarams became centers for the exchange of local goods as well as for exotic goods and other commodities carried in by long distance trade. Thus, the nagarams were part of the wider network of international trade. Historian Hall has tried to place the nagarams within a hierarchy of trade. He has remarked that the villages of the Nadu were linked to the nagaram, which in turn were linked to the higher marketing centers or managarams, where trade and commerce was controlled by the guilds. However, historian Champaka Lakshmi has urged a closer examination of this argument and has pointed out that trade and commerce in the Managarams were controlled by local Nagaram members rather than merchant groups. There is, however, a need for caution while studying the Nagarams. While on the one hand, they often developed into leading urban centers, this is not true for all of them. A lot of them were not part of the international trade network, but rather they mainly served as the market for the Nadu villages and functioned strictly in a local capacity as centers of exchange. In some of these nagarams, the local merchant groups were powerful enough to resist control for any extra local groups. On the other hand, those nagarams, which became markets for the larger merchant groups, experienced startling levels of urban expansion. The nagarams went through three phases of development, which correspond to three phases of Chola history. The early phase 850 to 985 CE, the middle phase 985 to 1150 CE, and the late phase 1150 to 1279 CE. In the early Chola period, the Nagarams were yet to establish links with larger mercantile organizations outside the Kaveri Delta region, and only select parts like Pudukottai, Salem, Urayur, Tiruchirappalli, Tirunelveli, and South Arcot had started to develop such links. There has been no evidence of a royal policy to encourage overseas trade or develop ports at this time. The middle Chola period saw the profusion of nagarams with not just the heartland but also border areas and even in newly conquered territories. The Cholas employed a tactic of establishing nagarams in these areas as a means of consolidating their hold on the territory. They also founded Brahmadeyas in such areas. Champaka Lakshmi has termed the nagarams as interdependent agents of political synthesis. Thus, the nagarams became part of a broader interregional and overseas trade network and also gained political significance. Another aspect of nagaram development in the middle Chola period was specialization of function. we see the development of special merchant organizations which focused on specific commodities. Thus, we have the Salya Nagarattar for marketing textiles and the Sankarappadi Nagarattar for supplying oil and ghee. These organizations were often composed of people who were originally craftsmen and producers of the commodity and later transformed into merchants. This specialization was a major factor in the urbanization of the Middle Chola period. The temples played a large part in this because, along with the ruling elite, the temples were some of the biggest consumers of trade goods and thus they drove market demand. With increased specialization, we have the emergence of a diverse array of new professions and groups in the temple towns, which steadily became larger as well as more elaborate and complex in nature, with separate quarters for the various merchant and artisan groups. Historians have also connected the extremely complex social stratification system that emerged at this time with this emergence of specialized craft and artisan groups. From the 10th century onwards, there was a marked increase in peninsular trade connecting the Tamil country with Kerala, Karnataka, and the Andhra region. And this was simply the continuation of an ancient pattern of trade. However, in this period, this trade intensified, and items like spices, aromatics, incense, horses, gems, and textiles became notable items of commerce. But this growth of trade was not just internal but also external. South Asian trade was expanding and linking up with Southeast Asia and China. This has been discussed in the lecture on maritime trade in India. This new major pattern of trade linked up with the Nagaram network and became a major factor of urbanization in the middle and later phase of Chola rule. Historians have argued that this carried forward urbanization trends that had started in the 10th century till at least the 13th century. One growing feature that dominated trade and also the cities was the guild. Merchant guilds and organizations like the Ayavol and others became more and more important, and we can also see Manigranam organizations playing important roles in urban life and trade. In the late Chola period and in the post-Chola Panda kingdom, that is, from the 11th to the 14th centuries, guild activity increased phenomenally, and these merchant bodies also experienced a great enhancement of their power as they gained control not only over trade but on administrative matters like tolls and which parts of the towns they controlled. One such body was the Chitrameli organization of agriculturists, which played an important role in fixing urban tolls, trade commissions, and urban quarters for various communities in the later Chola period when royal authority had been weakened. As far as urban experience goes, historians Spencer and Hall have compared the South Indian urban experience to that of medieval Northern Europe. They have pointed out how in Europe there were conflicting and competing urban interest groups like the episcopals and the burghers, whereas in South India, the political, religious, and cultural institutions were more integrative, and this special nature helped the preservation of urban vitality, even though economic factors had given the cities their greatness. now we come to the conclusion. Historian Champakalakshmi has pointed out that even though political, economic, religious, and cultural factors all worked together to cause cities to grow and remain vital over centuries, in different cities, different factors had varying levels of primacy. Also, some cities shared relationships of subordination or eminence with others, and therefore, any detailed history of South Indian urbanization should explore this factor while mapping out the network that linked all cities. However, Champakalakshmi also tried to identify if there was a single causative factor which resulted in the maintenance of urban forms, something that permeated all activities and institutions and could provide a site for urban consensus, while also holding a significant position of authority. According to Champakalakshmi, the answer to this was religion, specifically bhakti or devotion, and how that came to be expressed in the temple. Thus, Champakalakshmi came to the unavoidable conclusion that it was the temple and how all groups related to it that sustained the urban form in early medieval South India.